Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the Mail on Sunday columnist Dan Hodges and writer Ellie Mae O'Hagan. So hello to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages, and starting off with the Times. They say senior allies of Theresa May believe Boris Johnson is behind the push to make her resign. Open warfare in the party, says the Eye. Mrs May's supporters are said to have quelled the rebellion using WhatsApp. Same story, different take for the Daily Express. They report that the Prime Minister has crushed the plot to oust her. The Telegraph, moving that story on a bit, reporting that EU negotiators have stepped up their backroom talks with Labour over fears the government will collapse before Brexit. Germany and France have dashed Britain's hopes of fast-tracked Brexit talks by demanding that the divorce bill be resolved first. That's according to the Financial Times. The Mirror pictures Wayne Rooney carrying out his community service at a garden centre after his conviction for drink driving. While the Sun has details of the striker's date with a stripper, paint stripper that is. The Daily Star is reporting that England is being lined up to host the 2022 World Cup. That's after a leaked report warned of terrorism and corruption in Qatar. And the main story of the Daily Mail, the wealthy families exploiting the government's Help to Buy scheme. So plenty to talk about there with Dan Hodges and Ellie Mae O'Hagan. And the Prime Minister's extraordinary few days, I think, is still preoccupying a lot of the papers, isn't it? You've picked out the Eye's front page headline, which kind of sums it up, really. PM clings to power for now. Is that how you see it, that she's managed to see off a possible coup attempt, but not necessarily forever?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest, I mean, saying she saw off the coup attempt, I mean, I think that the plotters saw off their own coup attempt, actually. I mean, as coup attempts go, I mean, we were talking about this before, we seem to live in the era of rather shambolic coup attempts, and now, sadly, Grant Shapps has joined the ranks of those who lead them in a rather ham-fisted way. I mean, Grant. I mean, I know Grant, and he's a very nice guy. But I mean, I don't know what he thought he was doing here. I mean, for some reason, he decided to go on the radio this morning. Firstly, admit he was organising this plot. Then, when asked if it was true that he'd secured 50 signatures calling for the Prime Minister.
30, wasn't it?
Well, no, he was asked if he'd secured 50.
Oh,
because
apologies.
the rumour yesterday was that 50 had been secured. He then admitted no, it was only 30. He was then asked if any cabinet ministers were involved and said no. And after that, it sort of faded from there. So that has assisted Theresa May. But the reality is that and we've seen this before with these sorts of plots. You can cling on, and you can dismiss them, and you can defeat them for a short period of time. But if you keep coming back to it, then eventually, you know, somebody wields the knife and somebody gets you. And the context for this is, you know, this was a party conference and a Prime Minister's speech that was supposed to stabilise her position. And obviously, as we've seen, the reality is it's done the opposite. Well,
yes, and why has it done the opposite? I mean, is it just because she coughed during her speech, Ellie Mae?
No, I don't think that's why. Obviously, you know, the speech... I see the speech as a symbol of the chaos of the Tory party at the moment rather than a cause of it. You know, I think that... If it had been any other time in the Tory party's history, if it had been before the snap election, when everything seemed to be going great for Theresa May, it would have been laughed off as an unfortunate mishap. But the reason it has become so symbolic, it's become such a big deal, is because it is symbolic of a wider chaos. And, you know, we were talking about this earlier, and we were sort of joking about, you know, coups in political parties. And I followed the Labour Party coup very, very closely. And I think a similar thing is happening here as happened with the coup against Jeremy Corbyn, which is that the faction that want to get rid of Theresa May are not thinking about the fact that they actually don't have any ideas. If you take out all of the shambles of the letters falling off, you know, behind her, and the coughing and the protester and all of that, actually her policy offer was incredibly weak. The signature policy was an energy price cap, which was odd because she was also talking about how great free markets are. So that's sort of quite inconsistent. But also it was, stolen from Ed Miliband's 2015 manifesto, which the Tories at the time called communism. So even if they did get rid of Theresa May, I think at the moment they are suffering from a longer-term lack of ideas.
Do you think that's right? It's about there isn't an excitement behind a new idea or a new person?
I think there's an element of that. I mean, I think also, frankly, the Tories are panicking a bit. I mean, they were freaked and spooked by Labour's conference. I'm not entirely sure why, because having been at Labour's conference, I found it a rather surreal experience. But it's certainly, it certainly freaked them. Jeremy Corbyn has.
That's only because you had too much to drink at the Mirror Party, though. Well,
I tell you what, I was more freaked when I was sober at Labour Party conference than after I'd had a few drinks. But Jeremy Corbyn certainly got into their. Has certainly got into their heads. But look, the reality is they still haven't recovered from the election. An election they thought they were going to win by a mile, and an election which cost them their majority. And the reality is, this coup has been seen off. But the fundamental problems for the Conservative Party remain.
And I'm just going to reflect a couple of other front pages. We have just got The Guardian in, for example, which you won't have seen before, but just to show viewers at the same time as you. Ditch Johnson and reshuffle MPs to tell May. That subheading there saying Foreign Secretary faces growing anger as plot to oust PM fails to gain momentum. Why the focus on Boris Johnson? Because of all the articles seeming to put pressure on Theresa May ahead of her big speeches. Is that why he's the main focus, do you think, according to this article?
Well, I mean, to me, the Tory conference at times seemed to be kind of more like Boris Johnson Glastonbury than it was, this actual Tory conference. I mean, I'm not really massively interested in the machinations of the internal politics of the Tory party, but I do think she should get rid of him. I mean, he's... what he said about Libya, Libya will be the next Dubai if they clear the dead bodies away. This is our Foreign Secretary. This is someone who represents us to other countries. And actually what was not reflected in our press is that was picked up by the international press across the world in a very negative way. And I think he actually doesn't represent us well. I think he embarrasses us. And for that reason alone, I think she should get rid of him.
And the Times headline, May fights to get a grip. Do you think that a cabinet reshuffle would be a sign of strength? Would that help her kind of create a sense of order?
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that's where we're going. I mean, I have to say, picking up on the Boris Johnson point, I mean, I was at, spent the week at Tory conference, and I can't recall a party conference that I've been to where a senior cabinet minister has been the subject of such antipathy from their cabinet colleagues, other MPs, and indeed the party activists. I mean, Boris did actually quite a skillful conference speech in which he sort of drew back from his direct challenge to Theresa May. But it's not that long ago that he was the darling of the Conservative Party and the sort of the heir apparent to take over from David Cameron. And it is quite staggering how he's blown it. I mean, he has, mounted a succession of we're talking about Grant Shapps, a succession of his own ill-judged sort of sallies against the Prime Minister. And his name is mud now within the Conservative Party, and it's quite an incredible fall from grace for the once darling of the Tories, to be honest.
Let's move on to The Telegraph, because they have a different angle on everything. They suggest there that Brussels is talking to Labour because there are concerns that the Conservative government may not last until Brexit has to be agreed by. Yeah,
this is really interesting when you think about what's gone on in the last few months, that the idea that Theresa May held this snap election to stabilise the government as we were going into Brexit negotiations, that was the reason that she gave. And now we're actually in a position where apparently the EU is secretly talking to Jeremy Corbyn and to Keir Starmer, who's the shadow Brexit secretary, in case the government collapses. I actually interviewed Keir Starmer a while ago for a media outlet called Unearthed, about Labour's Brexit positions. And I have to say, I know that you're going to complain.
There are several of them, aren't there? That must have been quite a long interview, given all, if he was going to go through all of them.
Are you done?
Yeah.
I have to say, I know you're going to moan. I know you're going to say, or you would say that.
I never moan.
But I do think he would be a much better negotiator than someone like Liam Fox, for example, because he was the director of public prosecution, so he's very, very familiar with the law. It was very clear to me that he knew about the technicalities of Brexit, and he was very convivial. He's a very open person who obviously wanted to approach the EU with the idea of doing a deal that would suit both the EU and Britain. And, you know, when I asked him, you know, I said to him, come on, you really want to stay in the EU, don't you? Be honest. And he, you know, said in quite a sincere way that actually he was worried about the future of his children. So I did actually leave that interview feeling like he would do quite a good job.
And this article does remind us that while all this is going on, and to use that cliche, the clock is ticking. I mean, there isn't so much time to do a deal on Brexit. And can the Conservative Party afford to spend time talking about its leader?
Well, I think one of the reasons why the coup has failed is a number of people on both sides of the Conservative Party have said, look, we just can't afford this whilst these important negotiations are going on. But I mean, in terms of the specific story, I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword for Labour. Obviously, there is an advantage here, and it sort of builds up Labour's credibility, the fact that the EU are now talking to Labour, but frankly, Labour wants headlines focusing on Labour's position on Europe, like it needs a hole in the head, because obviously, you know, Ellie's talked about her discussion with Keir Starmer, who is quite unequivocal, well, almost unequivocally, everything's equivocal with Labour's position, but privately is obviously very much takes a pro-European stance. The reality is, though, he's not leader of the Labour Party, and Jeremy Corbyn takes completely the opposite stance. And Labour, we've talked about this.
That's a fair reflection of Keir Starmer's position. I did challenge him on that, and I think he's quite open about the fact that he would have preferred that we remained, but he doesn't really think that it's a realistic possibility because we voted to leave.
Well, tell all the Labour Remainers that, because they're not going to be happy about that.
OK, on that note, we are going to take a break. Plenty more to talk about after the break, including a final farewell to Liz Dawn. That's coming up. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, Dan Hodges and Ellie Mae O'Hagan. And we're going to take a look at the Daily Mail's front page. Their headline is Wealthy Exploit Help to Buy Scheme. And obviously this was a scheme aimed at getting young people onto the housing ladder, presumably not aimed at the wealthy.
Yeah, I mean, I think this I think the story is quite interesting because it actually frames the government's political problem on this issue. I mean, on the one hand, we keep being told the political problem for the government is there is just not enough affordable housing for people to rent, and that's creating a housing crisis and forcing particularly younger people. Obviously, everything at the moment is run through the prism of younger voters, as if no other voters actually bother to go at the ballot box. But it's run through the prism, and they have to stay at home, and this is causing this great political crisis. At the same time, we're also told that actually the Thatcherite dream of being a home-owning, this great home-owning society is also collapsing. Young people can't buy their own homes anymore, and that's another terrible problem. And I think also, what's interesting about this scheme is it's got my favourite thing in terms of statistics, which says 4 in 10 recipients were earning more than $50,000 a year, so a majority weren't. 1 in 10 were on at least $80,000 a year, so 9 out of 10 weren't. So, I've got some sympathy with the government on this. They're kind of damned if they do and they're damned if they don't.
Obviously, I disagree with that.
Shock.
Because I think...
Shock horror.
Because I think that, Help to Buy is like trying to cover up a bursting dam with a plaster. There is a housing crisis in this country, particularly in the capital, and we need a massive house building programme of social housing and genuinely affordable housing to address what is essentially a crisis. And the reason that young people are talked about in the media all the time is not because they are the only people who go to the ballot box, it's because some people consider young people more important than what they vote for. And the fact is that young people at the moment, they're facing a future of precarious work, of not being able to afford a home, of all the things that their parents took for granted. And that is a catastrophe. And it's also a crisis of capitalism, because, you know, the message of capitalism is you work hard, you go to school, you get a job, you work hard, and then you get your own home and you get some security. But if you're, 21 and you come out of university with big debts, what happens now? You go to school, you've been to school, you get a job, you work hard with no benefits, no security, and you have really very little hope, unless you have rich parents, of buying a home. And so, that to me is what this problem represents, the problem of housing in this country. It's a crisis of capitalism, and it needs to be fixed with a house building programme. And I just don't think that Help to Buy is enough. It's too big a problem and too small a solution.
Well, I'm glad to see you making the robust case for capitalism. That's quite a departure for.
That's an interesting interpretation of what I just said, but okay.
For our discussions, but again, I think you put your finger on the problem. It's always we want more. We want, obviously, of course, we all want lots and lots of affordable housing.
Come on, Dan.
But where is the affordable housing going to come from? Are we going to, today, at the moment, we're talking about affordable housing. In a couple of weeks we'll be talking about the NHS. In a couple of weeks after that, we'll be talking about education.
You know what? There
in a couple of weeks after that, we'll be talking about police cuts.
There are plenty of countries around the world. There are plenty of countries around the world.
Writing, filling out the checkbook, can we?
First of all,
because the whole point is that's not affordable housing.
Okay.
That's unaffordable.
Quick word,
housing.
Ellie Mae, because we need to move on.
Affordable housing is something that has existed in this country until about 10, 15 years ago. It's not some kind of pipe dream that is unrealistic. It's existed here for the second half of the 20th century. To act like it's some fantasy that can never be fulfilled is just ridiculous.
OK, we are going to move on because we've only got a few seconds left, and we do want to pay tribute to Liz Dawn, because whose funeral it was today, tributes were paid to her at least by all of these stars, and what a great character she played and a person she was.
Well, I wanted to pick this up because I love Vera and Jack. I love Liz Dawn. She's a Labour woman as well, like me. And the other fact that the reason why I love Vera and Jack so much is that I actually have an auntie and uncle called Vera and Jack. So I have my very own Vera and Jack. And many years ago, Dan and I went to a Labour Party conference in Manchester, and we ended up on the set of Coronation Street.
We did, didn't we? We ended up in the Rovers.
Had a drink in the Rovers.
We ended up in the Rovers.
It was very exciting. In fact,
yes.
All of the old rivalries were sort of forgotten for a night, and I seem to remember some right-wing blogger and Ed Balls getting a selfie outside the Rovers' return because Coronation Street brings people together.
It does.
Oh, fantastic stuff. Well, a lot of tributes in the papers and a lot of photographs of all the people that went to her funeral as well. So great tributes there. We must leave it there. You will both be back at 11:30 with another selection, of course. Ellie Mae and Dan, for the moment, though, thanks very much indeed.